Hello, everyone. We're glad you could join us for our continuing study of Gospel of Mark. Tonight, we are going to be in Mark chapter 6. We began a study of this chapter in our Wednesday night class at the church building this past Wednesday evening, and we studied through verse 13 of Mark 6. In that particular section, we talked about Jesus sending out the 12 on what's called the limited commission. Also, Jesus is rejected by those of his own hometown in Nazareth as he reads from the book of Isaiah and claims that these prophecies are fulfilled in their hearing in him. And the people were incensed at that message. So even though we're early on in the Gospel of Mark, things are moving rapidly. And though we see Mark detailing many of the miracles of Jesus and the wild and wide popularity that Jesus enjoys because he is compassionate and responsive to the people, at the same time, resistance is growing against Jesus. And he's having clashes, especially with the Pharisees, because he is remote from Jerusalem. We don't read a lot about the Sadducees opposing him because they are primarily rooted in Jerusalem, and they are the priestly class, and they control the temple and its activities. The Pharisees are scattered far and wide, so we see a lot more interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees. The first thing that we'll talk about from Mark 6 tonight is the beheading of John the Baptist. This is a sad event. And when Mark introduces it here in chapter 6, it is retrospectively. That is, it's already occurred, and Mark had not said anything about it. We do find that Jesus had left Judea and went to spend most of his time, his ministry in Galilee when John had been arrested. But we don't really get any other details as to what happens to John, except we get this particular episode of his execution by Herod Antipas. So again, it's a very poignant, sad story. The great prophet has done his job. God allows him to be removed from the scene, and he does so allowing some horrible circumstances to unfold without interfering in that. So let's read the account in Mark 6, beginning in verse 14. Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said it is Elijah, and others said it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, This is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him, and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things, and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came, when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. So she went out and said to her mother, What shall I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Well, as I said in the notes here, what a shame it is that so vile and wretched a man as Herod Antipas would have the final say in earthly terms about John's life. He's the instrument of John's execution. This is, as we say, the oft-puzzling providence of God. Why God does certain things or why God allows certain things to happen certainly is puzzling to us very often. We think of John. He has been very faithful to his calling. He's been a humble man before God, but a bold and courageous man before men. He was willing to yield and give way to Jesus when Jesus came after him. He knew his purpose. He knew his mission. He was willing to step aside. He was not bound by his ego. And as good a man as John was, and as faithful as he was to his charge, to have that good life be taken by the gross excesses of a man like Herod is really sad. But God allows it to happen. And so John demonstrated the spirit that the apostles themselves are going to need in days to come. John stood up to an immoral, ungodly ruler. He didn't compromise or keep silent. He spoke, and as a result, he was imprisoned. And Jesus obviously is reflecting on this episode. Can you imagine being the one who was introduced by the great prophet, and because of the work of that prophet, he is killed? I mean, this is definitely a harbinger of what lies ahead for Jesus. Of course, Jesus knows the outcome of his life. He knows his destiny, but he's seeing it plainly in front of him with the beheading of John the Baptist. In the notes, I've got some items here on the Herodian family. If you've ever studied it, if you've ever seen some chronological and family charts of the Herodian family, you can look these up online. You can Google them, or if you have some other historical reference works to the New Testament, you'll be able probably to find the family tree of the Herodians. But prepare yourself; it's complicated. These were immoral people. There were multiple marriages. There were incestuous marriages. There's treachery. There's insanity. This was a horrific family, just terrible. We don't read anything good about them in the New Testament. So looking at our notes, if you have those available to you, I noted here that the name Herod, which is a dynastic name, it's the name of the dynasty, like Pharaoh would be in the Old Testament. It means heroic, which that family was anything but. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia summarizes the Herodian family with this: the entire family history is one of incessant brawls, suspicion, intrigue, and shocking immorality. And so here with the Herod that's mentioned, now I referred to him as Herod Antipas. And if you look that up in a concordance or Bible dictionary, you will look in vain for that name to be found in the New Testament. The term Herod Antipas, the specific name Antipas, comes from Josephus, as does Herodias' daughter Salome, the name she's usually known by. That is not in the Bible either. That is from Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian of the first century that defected from the Jews to the Romans during the siege of Jerusalem, leading to its destruction in AD 70. There are many things in which Josephus is a faithful chronicler of the history of his day. There are other things that are more dubious and suspect, but there's no reason to question the particular Herod that we've got mentioned here being Herod Antipas. Antipas was granted the regions of Galilee and Perea when his father Herod the Great died. And then his brother Herod Philip was made tetrarch of Gaulonitis, Trachonitis, Batanea, and Peneus. Tiberius, the emperor Tiberius, is the one that bestowed the title Herod upon Antipas, and thus was passed to others in the family. And this Herod we're talking about here becomes infamous for his interactions with John and the beheading of John, and just briefly his interaction with Jesus during his trial. So that's the one and the same Herod Antipas. Herod the Great, his father, was in power when Jesus was born, was responsible for killing the babies, the baby boys in Bethlehem. And then later on in the book of Acts, we read about Herod Agrippa I and Herod Agrippa II. So that kind of sums up most of the figures of the Herods that we see in the New Testament. This whole clash between John the Baptist and Herod is based on Herod's unlawful marriage to his own niece, who also became his sister-in-law, married to Philip, his brother. And then Herod woos her away from Philip and marries her. And so this is what has led to this confrontation that we're reading about here in Mark chapter 6. And so as Jesus becomes more famous and even eclipses the popularity of John, we see here from our reading that people had a lot of different ideas about who Jesus was. As we read back on these things, and we have learned a lot of subsequent things from other teaching in the New Testament, we have 2,000 years of hindsight. We're in a much better position to draw these conclusions. But these people were seeing it unfold, and they were trying to grasp the true nature of Jesus as events were taking place. His own disciples, those closest to him, struggled with this as well. And they came to a more complete understanding of Jesus over a long period of time. But as Jesus is doing the various miracles and healing people and drawing great multitudes, Herod's conclusion, probably by his guilt complex and by his superstition, he says, this is John the Baptist risen from the dead. And then he mentions again in verse 16, this is John whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. So there was a degree of superstition here among the people. And so Herod does not have his understanding of things rooted in Scripture. And so the fears, the anxieties, the guilt, all the things that plague us on an emotional level, these things are... They give way, they make us vulnerable to things that aren't real, like superstitions of one kind or another, or this idea of a ghost being present on the earth. And so this is Herod's superstitious guilt coming out. And he thinks John the Baptist, I suppose, has come back to haunt him or come back bigger than he was before Herod killed him. I don't know all what was going on in Herod's mind, but he does attribute the identity of Jesus as being John, which we know simply is not the case. Others said it is Elijah, and that's a reasonable conclusion because Elijah was mentioned in the Old Testament as coming. Of course, that's a metaphor. It wasn't forecasting a literal resurrection of the prophet Elijah, but one who would come in the spirit and power of an Elijah would be a great and powerful force to the political leaders of his day. And of course, Jesus directly attributes those prophecies to John the Baptist, not himself. So these people are misguided, though at least they're basing their view on a scriptural idea. Others said, well, it is the prophet, that is the Messiah or the servant who would come as prophesied in the Old Testament, or like one of the prophets. What all this tells us is everybody's confused. They're really confused as to who Jesus is. They see him working great miracles, like Nicodemus said, we know, teacher, that no one can do these signs unless God is with him. And so while they're attributing a heavenly approval, if you will, or an origin, if you will, of Jesus actually coming, they're just not quite clear on his identity. Well, who is this exactly? Is he fulfilling some Old Testament prophecy? Is he merely a prophet? Is he something more than a prophet? And Jesus wants people to investigate this. He wants them to look more deeply into this question. And so the explanation of Herod's superstition is given in verse 17. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. And then, of course, John boldly says directly to him, you're in an unlawful marriage. You have no right to Herodias. Well, how do you think that made Herodias feel? Because I think we have no doubt from Josephus and from the accounts of what has transpired, Herodias has left Philip to marry Herod because she felt like that was the best political move. She felt like she was hitching her wagon to a greater power. And now John the Baptist is threatening that. For John to be saying to Herod, you have no right to be married to Herodias, is a direct threat to Herodias's ambitions. And she does not like it, and she is a treacherous person. So this sets up the stress between Herod and Herodias, because Herod is intrigued by John. Even though John is condemning his marriage, he sees something in John probably that he is not. He sees courage, and he sees conviction, and he sees strength. And Herod is drawn to that, but he himself really doesn't possess those characteristics, as we will see as this story unfolds. So Herodias held it against John in verse 19. Herodias held it against John and wanted to kill him, but she couldn't because John had the favor of Herod. It says in verse 20, Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and protected him. Now we have a variant reading here in the New King James. If you're reading out of another version, you probably saw that I read something quite differently at the end of verse 20. I'll read it again, just that last statement. And when he heard him, that's when Herod heard John, he did many things and heard him gladly. That particular reading is probably not the best rendition of those words, and more modern translations will have something like, he was much perplexed. Herod was perplexed by what he was hearing, but he was drawn to it. He respected John. He saw John as a just and holy man. He didn't believe in John and didn't have the strength to turn him loose from prison, but he still enjoyed hearing what John had to say, and he ran interference for John between him and Herodias. So he's hearing John gladly, though John apparently tweaks his conscience by the things that he's saying about his marriage. Well, in verse 21, Mark writes, then an opportune day came. And this is, again, a tragic ending to this story. And it certainly highlights the character flaws that we find in Herod Antipas. So I suppose this may have been commonly done at the time. It strikes me as being a little self-aggrandizing, but Herod on his birthday gives a feast for all of the nobles that are in his kingdom. Be better to have a birthday feast thrown for you than to do your own. But, you know, this is political. Herod's wanting to curry the favor of those who are in power. He wants their support in that day. Because you were a ruler did not guarantee you would continue ruling. You had to have Rome's permission to be in a position like Herod was in. And in fact, at the end of his life, Herod himself is exiled by the emperor. So because you were ruling didn't mean you would hang on to that rule, and others could send delegations or petitions to Rome against you and file to have you removed and have a trial. You could be recalled to Rome and stand before the emperor or the Senate, depending on what kind of a region you're ruling over. And like Herod later, you may be judged unfaithful in your rule and be banished or exiled or executed. So Herod's wanting to keep his nobles in his kingdom happy, the high officers, again, the chief men of Galilee, one of the two main regions over which he ruled. So the birthday feast is on, and Herodias sees this as an opportunity. Maybe, you know, not something you would normally think of, but this is a shrewd, conniving woman. She's a woman scorned by John for sure, but might be scorned by Herod if he keeps listening to that prophet. So she knows the character flaws of her own husband. She knows how to get to him. She knows how to inflame him in such a way that he will overcommit himself. So she is diplomatic, she's shrewd, she's evil. And so she uses this birthday celebration to, now I'm going to venture an opinion here. It isn't expressly said in Scripture, though. I believe it's a conclusion that, if it's not a necessary one, is a sound conclusion. I don't believe this is like your typical birthday party and break the piñata with a stick. This is a sensuous, vile, lewd party with drinking, and the dancing here I don't think was square dancing either. It would have likely been something that was sexually suggestive. So much so that in probably a half-drunken stupor or more, these men in attendance would have been enraptured by Salome's dancing. And so in the midst of this, it says she came in. This is not Herod's daughter, but stepdaughter, the daughter of Herodias and Philip. She came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." This is not a dispassionate, off-the-cuff statement. This is a man under a spell, and I would suggest it's a spell of lust and lewdness. He is completely taken by his own daughter-in-law, or sorry, his stepdaughter. So this is undoubtedly a vile situation. He repeats it with this proverbial expression. You find this even in the Old Testament. Whatever you ask of me, I'll give it to you, up to half my kingdom. He did not mean that literally. He didn't have a kingdom to give. It was his by concession of the emperor. But again, this is a phrase we find in the Old Testament. It's a hyperbole. I'll do whatever you want me to do. And so he makes this blanket offer to Salome. And so she goes out, taking it very literally. She goes out and says, this is the offer he's made to me. What do I ask for? And this is the moment Herodias has been waiting for. Ask for the head of John the Baptist. So what do we see in Herod? He's self-aggrandizing by throwing himself this great party. He's likely lustful, again, in regard to the dancing. He's reckless and naive and promising her basically, the store. And then he's outmaneuvered. He's naive. He's outmaneuvered by a shrewd wife. And because he has already committed himself and made these oaths to Salome, she comes back in and says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter in verse 25. Well, he's been checkmated. Verse 26, the king was exceedingly sorry, but he isn't going to change his mind because of the oaths, number one, and because of those who sat with him. Right now, saving face and doing what he said he would do is more important than saving the prophet of God. That's how vile this man is. This is how unprincipled Herod is. And it's a shame that John is placed in his hands and has his fate decided by such a man. But such is God's permissive will. This is what God allows to be. Jesus will suffer a very similar fate at the hands of those who are unworthy to have Jesus in front of them. They too will give him up to death. It's a sorry episode in the history of mankind. And so Herod is nothing but a man pleaser. Again, he wants to save face. He wants to make himself look good. He doesn't want to backtrack. He could have said any number of things to get himself out of this. I did not promise you sin. I did not promise to break the law for you. I did not promise to do something immoral. I didn't promise you a man's life. But nonetheless, he's in his extremity. He's made his offer, up to half my kingdom. and he feels bound to keep his word. This is a weak man. This is a spineless man. And he gives in to the moment. And so verses 27 through 29, I would say to be a rather stoic and unembellished account of the death of John. It's like Scripture is in so many places. It's just very factual. For a moment as great as this, when a man like John is beheaded, there's no sensationalism. There's no great detail. It's very dispassionate. The king sent an executioner. He went and beheaded him in prison. He put his head on a platter. He brought it in. His disciples came and took away the corpse and buried it. I mean, that's basically it. You know, in a few short sentences, you have the fate and the end of life of a great man and a godly man and a great prophet. And yet Scripture speaks very economically of that. And so the dastardly deed is done, and John is killed, and now all of the attention is being focused upon Jesus. As we said, this is retrospective. So in the chronology, John has died before this, but as Jesus gets more popular and people begin to speculate on his identity, it's Herod going back and reflecting on what he's already done to John that Mark is actually covering in this particular section. Okay, let's move on with our next episode here in the reading. And this is a famous, by famous, I mean, not only do we know about it in the notes, I remarked, this is the only miracle in all four Gospels. I don't know if you knew that before this study, but I think that's an interesting observation. We might assume that all kinds of miracles are similarly told in all the Gospels, and there are many repeated in various Gospels, but this is the only one in all four. So that would seem to lend some degree of significance to what happens here. Verse 30 and following. Then the disciples gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitudes saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities, and they arrived before them and came together. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks and hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. Wow, what a story. Well, this is one of 2 such episodes where Jesus feeds multitude with an insufficient amount of food. Later on, there'll be another gathering of 4,000. So a large population served at one time. As I noted here in your outline, this is not a miracle just for 1 or 2 people, as is commonly the case. This is a miracle to be witnessed by and experienced by thousands at the same time. And so this story is interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, it demonstrates even the need for Jesus and his apostles to get away and get a break. We talk a lot in our day and time about stress, about pressure, rising anxieties. We're living under such pressure that we're beginning to see spikes in our internal systems, that we're not fighting off disease as well as we should. We're susceptible to all kinds of physical ailments because our resistance is low. We're under such stress, and Jesus is under a great amount of stress. We've seen him keeping a boat handy to not be crushed, or teaching from a boat with the multitudes on the shore. We've seen that the disciples couldn't eat because the crowds were so thick and they were clamoring for Jesus's attention. He is besieged. His disciples are besieged. They've just recently gotten back from their trip throughout Galilee, being sent out 2 by 2 to preach the kingdom. So there's an element of apparently emotional and physical exhaustion here. And Jesus says, let's get away from the crowds, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while, in verse 31. Well, good intention, but it doesn't really happen that way. If you have had an opportunity to Google pictures of the Sea of Galilee, or those that have been present in our Wednesday night study, we've had some PowerPoints showing us the Sea of Galilee. We can understand, you can see across the sea in the daylight. It's very easy to picture how, when Jesus took off in the boat with his disciples, people on the shore could have seen where they were going. And so as they're sailing across the sea, the people run around the north side from Capernaum. Capernaum's on the extreme northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. So they all make their way around the top of the sea, the north side of the sea, to go find Jesus where they disembarked on the other side. So they wanted to get away and get some rest and recuperation, but they don't have a chance because the multitudes gather. And so it says Jesus, when he saw them, was moved with compassion in verse 34, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They were not only wanting the physical healing, they were wanting to be near Jesus. They were wanting guidance. They were wanting teaching. And so this is what Jesus does. Again, in verse 34, he began to teach them many things. And so as the day goes on and the people are listening, and it's a huge crowd, I suppose it's possible, based on the circumstances, that Jesus could have addressed all of them at once. It depends on the acoustics and being where they were. But whatever the case, whether he's traveling in and amongst them and teaching, or having some one-on-one conversation, or it's all to the multitude, we're not really clear on that. But this goes on all day. And it says the day became later, and the disciples said, send the people away. They've not eaten all day. We've not eaten all day. Send them away so they can go get something to eat. And Jesus presents this rather puzzling option to them. He says, well, why don't you give them something to eat? And there's not really an explanation of what he was getting at here. We can only extrapolate maybe from the situation itself and what follows. But it may be that Jesus is wanting to bring home to them that in the future, God is going to want them to serve multitudes. God is going to want them to feed multitudes. It isn't going to be so much with food for the stomach. It's going to be spiritual food. And they're only going to be able to get that from God. Just like on this occasion, from their own resources, they don't have sufficient to feed the multitudes. 5 loaves of bread, which we're thinking like pita bread, round pita bread, not a loaf of Wonder Bread. So we're thinking a little flat, round piece of bread that you would kind of tear off the main piece and hand out. But there's only 5 of those and 2 fish for however many this is. It says 5,000 men. I don't know how many women and children are present, but it's a crowd bigger than 5,000. We can probably be assured of that. So lots and lots and lots of fish wouldn't have been sufficient to feed that multitude. And so the response is given, shall we go and buy 200 denarii? That's 200 day wages. That's almost a year's worth of work. Shall we, if we have that much money with us, could we go buy that much food for the crowds? Shall we go and buy that much food and give them something to eat? So again, man's inability to feed the ones God wants fed versus God's ability to do that very thing. And so this leads Jesus to have them take inventory and see what's available, which is pitifully lacking. And so he has everybody sit down, and then as they began to distribute the food, this is interesting too, if we could have seen how it unfolded. But it's as if every time they reached into a basket to pull out a fish, there were 5 more, and you pull out one, there's 5 more. And they fed all of this multitude of people. And I suppose we could also say it's cooked fish, not raw fish. So it's prepared for them to eat. And just coming out of the bags, baskets, whatever they had available. And so Jesus looks to heaven, blesses what is the food that's available, and they divide it among all. So when they take up the leftovers, it says there's far more left over than they had actually started with. Full of fragments, 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. So, this is not a story that's not been seen before, or an event that's not been seen. We have Old Testament accounts of feeding people with insufficient food. We have Old Testament accounts of Elijah and Elisha raising the dead. Jesus is doing things that have been done before, but he also has the testimony to back it up. His own, John the Baptist testimony, the prophets of old, they're all attesting to the identity of Jesus, and then he's demonstrating the accuracy of that identification with these miraculous abilities. So it's not that Jesus is doing something that's never been done before in terms of the miracle, but the miracle backs up claims that have never been made before. Nobody had ever come claiming to be the servant or the great prophet or the Messiah or the anointed one, and then did miracles to show everybody that what they're saying was true. That has not been done before. So let me make a chronological note with you here, a harmony note. If we read this account in John 6 and verse 15, it says there that at the end of this episode, the people were so taken with Jesus, they wanted to take him and make him a king. And Jesus obviously doesn't want this. This is not the way he's going to become a king. He's going to do that by dying and being raised from the dead, ascending back into heaven, having become a perfect sacrifice for sin. So he withdraws himself from them after this. And the rest of John 6 is another interesting episode that takes place on the following day, but Mark does not record it, so we'll not give it any more time than that in our study. I did ask a couple of questions here in the notes. In spite of the fact that Jesus' rest was interrupted, how did he view the multitudes that followed him and the disciples around the Sea of Galilee? He had compassion on them. If he was irritated, he didn't show it. He continued to serve. He continued to help. And it may be that we all know that feeling, that we're engaged with someone in a spiritual study or a context or a relationship, and we're wanting to help and serve them. And sometimes you go beyond your physical needs, your tiredness, your hunger, your desire to do something else. This takes priority. And Jesus obviously has his priorities in the right place. The next question, describe the moral fabric of Jesus' miracles. What practical effects do his miracles have among those who are touched by them? Well, the moral fabric is Jesus always does good. Contrast that with what Satan does when he inhabits through his demons people on the earth. They're miserable. They do themselves harm and others harm, and they're out of control and foaming at the mouth and falling down and throwing themselves into fire and abusing themselves and unable to live among other people. It's just horrible. The moral fabric of Satan's interaction with people, but Jesus shows compassion. He shows concern for people. He's gentle with them. He gives them the things that they're needing. And the effect that has on them is they want to follow him. So much so that he can't get away from them for a little bit of R&R. So Jesus is enjoying great popularity at this point from the masses, not from the Pharisees. But it's because of the moral framework under which he's operating. He's doing good for people and doing it in ways that nobody else can do good for them. They can't get the things that they're needing for themselves or their loved ones from physicians who were basically useless in that day. Well, let's talk about the next episode beginning in verse 45 of Mark 6. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves, beyond measure, and marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. So Jesus sends the multitudes away after having fed them. He sends the disciples away in the boat to go back from east to west across the Sea of Galilee. Now, we have shown in our class on Wednesday night some topographical maps of this area. And one thing that this reveals is that when you go from the Mediterranean east into Galilee, you climb a mountain range, and then that drops off precipitously down into the Sea of Galilee, which is several hundred feet below sea level. So the moisture-laden winds come in off the Mediterranean, climb the mountains, condense. All of that turns into storms and rain, and then that rushes through the valleys and down the mountain onto the Sea of Galilee and bursts upon that sea in the form of great storms. And so what do we see here? The disciples are rowing back into that. They're rowing to the west, and a storm comes up in the night, and they simply make no headway. They can make no progress against that storm. And so what's interesting about the account here is that Jesus stays behind, it said, to pray. He sent the multitudes away because they were trying to make him a king by force, and he wasn't going to have that. So he sent them away. He stays on the mountain to pray. The disciples are in the middle of the sea getting nowhere. And it says about the fourth watch of the night, which is late into the night, actually the early morning hours. And it says Jesus saw them. Now they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the middle of the night. But Jesus saw them. He's not unaware. It's similar to the earlier example where Jesus is asleep in the boat, and the boat's in the storm again, and the waves are crashing over the sides of the boat, and the boat's taking on water. Jesus is not unaware of what's happening around him. In fact, he's hyper aware. And so he knows everything that's happening to the disciples, and he sees this unfolding. He himself is still on the land, and so he begins walking to them. And it said he was walking, I guess, parallel to the boat, and is going to keep on walking. And he gives them an opportunity to overcome their fear and invite him to come to them. Now, what fear? Well, Herod is not the only superstitious one. Superstition ran among the Jews in general. And so this idea of ghosts or a ghostly figure or someone reincarnated, you might think later on in the book of Acts, chapter 12, when Peter's released from prison by the angel, and he goes and he's knocking on the door, and Rhoda comes to the door, and he says, "Let me in," and she's overwhelmed by it and goes and tells everybody, "Oh, no, that's just his angel." So you see this idea pop up in different places in the New Testament, but it seems to be more a matter of their superstition, of perhaps some things that have been taught by the Jewish rabbis that were a matter of oral tradition, rather than what you would actually gain from Scripture. Whatever the case, they're afraid because they think this is a ghost. They're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. It's storming again. They're not getting anywhere. It's in the early watch of the morning. It's almost daylight. And this figure is walking across the sea. That's enough to unnerve, I'm sure, any of us had we seen that. But they see it and they're afraid, supposing him to be a ghost. They all saw him and were troubled. But he said to them, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." Again, I'll note with you, the phrase "do not be afraid" is found in so many places in Scripture, a lot in the Gospels in themselves, because fear is such a debilitating attitude to have, and it interferes with our faith in God. And fear overwhelms us sometimes when our faith is not as strong as it needs to be. Now, something that's left out of the account here by Mark is what is included in Matthew's account. And what's included there is the story of Peter requesting to go to Jesus on the water. And so this is in Matthew chapter 14. And so he said, "Lord, if it's really you, let me come to you on the water." It's puzzling sometimes to think of what Peter's thinking. But he does get out and begin walking on the water. And then it says that he began to look at the wind and the waves around him. And then he began sinking and cries out in a panic, "Lord, save me." So that is not included in Mark's account. And then after Jesus does lift Peter up out of the water, he gets in the boat with them. And it says here in verse 51, they were greatly amazed, number one, beyond measure, number two, and marveled, number three. So Mark's throwing, everything into the kitchen sink here to try to express how shocked they were. And, we think, why would they be shocked? I mean, these are men that have worked miracles by now. Remember, Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 and gave them power over demons, power over sicknesses. They'd already worked miracles. But something about this miracle appears to be sort of a watershed moment and takes them even further in their understanding of Jesus. And so they're just agog. That they're still trying, like the others that we saw earlier, like those that had various opinions of who Jesus was. Even the disciples are trying to put this together and understand as clearly as they possibly can. But they're amazed by what they see here. And so in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 33, the 12 it says they worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God. Truly you are the Son of God." So again, a watershed moment. They seem to have their eyes opening even wider and wider now as time goes on as to who this Jesus really is. There's only one short section here at the end we'll read through quickly, verse 53 and following. "When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they had come out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, ran through that whole surrounding region, and began to carry about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he entered, into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched him were made well." This is just an explosion of healing power, of popularity. The pandemonium is palpable here as the people are hearing about Jesus. The rumors are flying around. Yes, the healer, the great healer is here, and people are bringing all of their sick out into the public places, laying them out wherever they could in the marketplaces. This would have been open air hospitals and people desperate for healing. It's hard for us to imagine how awful it would have been. I mean, think of what we're going through with COVID, and we have all of the advantages of modern medicine, of scientists studying this virus and working on vaccines and hospital care for those that get it and get sick enough. It's been a trauma for us as a nation, as a world, to deal with coronavirus. Could you imagine having no good medical treatment except maybe herbal remedies of some kind, natural healings, but nothing like what we have now? And people would have been afflicted by all kinds of things that we don't maybe think about anymore because we've treated so effectively over the course of time. We don't, in the Western world, really have to deal with leprosy like they did, with other maladies that would cause you to go blind that could be now solved by an ophthalmologist or an optometrist. We live in a wonderful time, and it makes it a little hard maybe for us to realize how desperate these people would have been at the time. They just simply can't get any healing. We have already talked about the woman with the flow of blood for 12 years. She spent all of her money on doctors that didn't do anything for her. And yet here's Jesus with the spoken word or the touch or just the touch of his garment, people being made well. Just a complete outpouring of divine power. What a wonderful time that would have been to be alive and to experience that. Although Jesus wants people to see more than this in his life. He wants them to see more than physical healing. He wants them to see spiritual healing and extrapolate out from what he's doing to listen to what he's saying and then realize, wait, if he can heal my physical body like this, what could he do for my soul? Let's see, we've answered the next to the last question. Why did Jesus not accompany the disciples? And Peter, when did he begin to sink? When he took his eyes off Jesus and he started looking around and said, oh my, I'm out of the boat. And the waves are crashing and the wind is howling. He stopped looking at Jesus. And that is a very clear metaphor for us. When we stop looking at Jesus, when we let our faith in him waver, we begin to look aside and look at all the things in life that could go wrong. We let our fears control and dominate us, COVID and whatever else it may be, economic fallout from what's going on. When we take our eyes off of Jesus and we start looking at everything around, the world can be an intimidating place. The world can be a scary place. This is where Satan rules. This is where Satan dominates. He is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And if we allow our attention to be taken off of God and we start considering the powers of evil and the powers of unbelief, we can be overwhelmed and we can figuratively sink in the waves like Peter began to sink in the literal waves of the Sea of Galilee. Let us not let that happen to us. Let's keep our eyes firmly fixed on Jesus. Thank you for joining us for the study tonight. We hope it was profitable to you. I hope everybody has a good week, and may God bless all of us as we strive to live faithfully to him.